conservative, constitutional. It's the Andrew Cooperrider Show, keeping you informed on what's going on right here in Kentucky.
Well, everybody, welcome to another amazing Tuesday here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. Of course, I'm your host, Andrew Cooperrider. If you want to check out more about the show, more background, more episodes, feel free to visit theandrewshow.com. Once again, that's theandrewshow.com. Now, there is a slew of bills being considered over in the Senate today. Yesterday, they considered a few, but today there's a few that we want to dig into, that we want to talk about. First off is Senate Bill 75. Now, you may remember back in 2021, right after January 6th, Beshear jumping on the everybody's an insurrectionist, conservatives want to destroy everything, violence at the Capitol's train, decided to do something pretty unprecedented. For the first time in Kentucky's history, he decided to erect barriers to block off a part of Capitol Avenue. Now, if you've never been up to Frankfort, you may have no clue what I'm talking about, but as you go around Frankfort, there is a circular road called Capitol Avenue that cuts back behind the Capitol, between the Capitol and the Annex, and then comes around. And then there's a parking lot that goes back behind the Annex and also comes around to the parking garage back out. Now, typically when you hold events, rallies, those kinds of things, they're in one of two locations. It can either be in the front of the Capitol, a pretty common place, but also oftentimes they're held at the back of the Capitol. Part of it is because it's just a better location, depending on what the weather's doing. The sun hits you there. You'll be in the shade of the Capitol building if you're out in front. So a lot of times during the winter times or colder months, you'll have your rallies there out front. But also because it's closer to the legislators' actual offices. So the legislators, other than the Senate president and a few others, they may be in the main Capitol building and be able to hear you, and see your crowd when you're in front. But when you're behind the main building, they can see you out in front of the Annex as well as there by the Capitol building. You also have the chance, though not often, of being able to see a legislator as they are walking from the Annex over to the Capitol building, though there is a tunnel underneath. Now, it used to be you could also hold events there in that tunnel and hang up things, but Beshear shut that down as well. So jumping on that gravy train of everybody being afraid of people's violence, of government deciding that it can't be afraid of its people, even though, as the old saying goes, when people are afraid of their government, that is tyranny, but when the government is afraid of its people, that's liberty. But despite that, for some unknown, unfruition security concern, despite the hundreds of years, over 100 years, that road had been open there behind the building, Beshear put up those barricades. Well, Senate Bill 75 is taking an aim at saying, no, you're going to be taking those barricades and those poles down. You are going to tear down that barricade, Beshear. Beshear, tear down those poles. Now, Beshear's claim, of course, is that, this provides security concerns as cars are not able to drive through the area, and as crowds gather to protest or what have you, they can't have drive-by attacks. And he actually cited Charlottesville, where a car ran into protesters, and cited that as another reason why. He's saying the federal government suggested this as well. But I can tell you this much. For all those times it's been up there, it's never been a problem. On top of that, it does create some logistical problems, which is exactly what Beshear wanted. Because remember, at this time, Beshear was experiencing particularly high rates of protests right there against him at the Capitol. And he wanted to put a stymie to it. He wanted to stop that. So he decided, if I put up sanctions, that makes it a little bit harder, because it's harder to find a place to park. You got to walk farther compared to there used to be parking spots right up there up front. So you'd get there early enough, you'd park, you'd be able to bring your PA systems and what have you real close by. You'd be able to set up your tables. You wouldn't have to be carrying things very far at all. However, Beshear decided to go ahead and close that area off, making it so much harder, so much more difficult, people having to walk farther in order to partake in the, protests, rallies, those kinds of things that happen at the Capitol, the kinds of things citizens do when they want to see bills pushed. So Senate Bill 75 takes an aim at tearing those down. Quite an interesting bill, of course. You know, it's really just about taking down the imagery of a government that's, trying to tyrannically oppose its people, because that's why Beshear put it up in its first place. It's largely symbolic, but at the same time, it's very important, I believe, to go ahead and do that. There is a few other things being considered in the Senate, such as Senate Bill 334 by Southworth. We'll be digging into that after this break, but today's show, we're going to be digging into a few different issues, all based around this idea, these preconceived notions that we so often don't challenge within government. And that could either be because the establishment Republicans see no reason to challenge these notions. I'm talking about notions such as, that we need more people to vote, notions like teachers are not paid enough. Both things we're going to be talking about and digging into today. But the other thing going on with Senate Bill 334 is we're seeing continued weird behavior out of Michael Adams. I mentioned either earlier this week, last week, about Damon Thayer actually taking a shot at Michael Adams because there was an article wrote about turnover in the legislature in Frankfurt. And of course, that was about the legislative branch. It had nothing to do with the Secretary of State. But despite that, the Secretary of State tweeted that out with a term about how this is somehow about the Secretary of State. And so Damon Thayer retweeted Michael Adams's statement saying somehow an article about legislative turnover has become about the Secretary of State, but yet here we are. And a large part of that could be because Damon Thayer and Adams are squaring up to possibly be facing off against each other for a governor spot here shortly, or a congressional spot. As Adams has signaled, he definitely plans to run for high office. But which is weird is that Adams is taking every step he can to alienate more members of the Republican Party and bring in more of the left, which is an interesting move. As they say, movie Dodgeball, that's a bold move, Cotton. We'll see how that works out. Because not only is he alienating and has always alienated people on the conservative right side of things, just due generally to his behavior, the way he conducted himself during COVID, of course, his general views about election security. If you have any questions about your elections at all, well, Michael Adams takes issues with that. You might remember in 2022, there was a few people that had filed for recounts. There was a law passed that allowed a candidate for office, if they wanted to go ahead and get a recount done in an election, as long as they paid for it themselves, they'd be free to do so. Well, Michael Adams went to court. He spent millions of our tax dollars in these court battles, and in order to take a stand, in his words, in order to fight against vote recount efforts by these people that they were paying for themselves. It wasn't even going to cost the taxpayer dollars anything, but for some reason he took issue with it, and he takes issue with any kind of claim dealing with election integrity, which has led to some odd behavior on Senate Bill 334, which outlaws certain kinds of voter identification being used in Kentucky. So we'll be digging into Senate Bill 334, its provisions, what it will do, what it won't do after this short break. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. If you want to reach out to the show, feel free to email me, info@theandrewshow.com. Once again, that's info@theandrewshow.com. I could read it out on air, answer your questions for you. Just reach out there, info@theandrewshow.com. We'll see you back here in a few short minutes. And you are back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. Before the break, we were talking about Senate Bill 334, a bill proposed by Senator Southworth, that takes an aim at looking at some of our voter identification provisions. So right now, in law, you can use a student ID, employer ID, or even a credit or debit card to prove identity when you're showing up to vote. It doesn't necessarily require you to show a government ID. So Senate Bill 334 is taking an aim at that part of election security here in Kentucky by requiring a actual government ID in order to vote. Now, obviously, this is a very easy thing to accomplish, to get a government ID. We'll talk about that here in a second. Now, currently in law, just so you know, if you show up to vote and you don't have your government ID with you, you can cast what's called a provisional ballot. So you're still able to say, no, this is me, this is who I am. I'm going to go ahead and fill out a ballot under my name, but then they will not count that ballot until you show back up, either at the polls or at the county clerk's office, if it's the next day, with your proper identification in order to take ownership of that provisional ballot for those votes to actually count. So there is something in law right now that if you show up to the polls and you don't have your identification, they still offer you a workaround here in the state of Kentucky that will eventually require you to show your ID, but you could still go ahead and vote. So Adrian Southworth proposes this bill, and for some very odd, unknown reason, Michael Adams has been takes this very personally, and well, it's not an unknown reason. We know why Michael Adams takes this personally. Any kind of attack at all, perceived attack on our current voting laws or systems, Michael Adams takes personally. But he also is of the type, just like the establishment Republicans, to buy into this idea, this conception, this thought that we need everybody we can to vote, and that's just not factually true. We get so caught up on things like voter turnout and talking about it as if it's a good thing, as if we need people to turn out to vote. But that actually, now as a candidate, you may want to say, I want more of my voters to turn out than the others. And of course, in general elections, individual parties will say, we need to turn out more Republicans voting in order, of course, to win Republican elections. So there's reasons within campaigns, within political parties, to get a sect of voter to turn out. But as government, as individuals, as we think about this, looking at the turnout rate and even judging based upon, oh, it's low or high or what have you, is absolutely a ridiculous thing, in my opinion. It needs to be something that we stop doing in our modern society, caring about how many people show up to vote. We need to care. Of course, when you're looking at, once again, election analysis, you may care how many of individual parties showed up. But actually looking at the overall percentage and saying we need more people involved in elections. You know, recently I heard Dr. Stephen was Voss, the political science head over there at the University of Kentucky, often called on to political shows here in Kentucky or local talk shows to talk about, you know, various things to deal with politics. And one of the things he talks about often is they were discussing early voting. And Adrian Southworth and a few others, Schickel actually proposed the bill this year to get rid of those 3 days of early voting. And granted, you know, regardless of how you feel about early voting, and we've had discussions about how it is not constitutional, according to our state constitution, you can like it, but that doesn't mean it's constitutional. But Voss's point that he made was that, well, we want those early voting days because we want more voter participation because that's a better representation of democracy. But while that may be a democracy, that isn't, one, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. That's important. But two, that isn't even what our founders envisioned. Remember, who could first vote when the country was founded? Yes, white, yes, male, but also they wanted them to be landowners. They wanted people who had skin in the game, in their opinion. They wanted people that were more educated on political issues and cared more about them voting. They wanted an informed electorate. That's part of the reason why they pushed public schools to begin with. Kentucky requiring a provision of public schools and the talk about requirements of states to provide public schools, something that our founders also talked about, was mainly due around a conversation that they would politically understand their government and would be able to participate in it with a knowledge base. So even our founders weren't worried about making our democracy more, quote unquote, accessible. They were worried about making sure we have educated people voting. But yet for some reason that has completely gone away, the care about educated people voting, to the point where even Dr. Voss here in the conversation I heard is talking about how we need more people voting because that's more representatory of a democracy, of our government would be more representative of the people, missing the fact that, well, we don't actually need more people voting. He just said that. And of course, the person interviewing him didn't challenge him on that point because it's this concept that has just leaked its way into our thought process that more people voting is a good thing. But it's not. We want educated people to vote. We want people who care to vote. And the way we figure out who cares enough about the politics, about the situation to cast a ballot is part of it is not making it incredibly difficult to vote, but by saying, hey, you got to vote on this one day in person. Creating that obstacle means that you are paying attention. If you care enough to show up that one day to vote, take time out of your day in person to go cast your ballot, then you at least care enough to maybe slightly a little bit pay more attention than that average guy. But of course, that's not what Democrats want. That's not what establishment Republicans want. And the reason why is because name ID and money favor when there's large amounts of voting. When you have lower turnout, that provides better opportunity for candidates that maybe don't have super high name ID, a lot of money, but they are a lot better on the issue. So the people who are informed, that are seeking out that information, that are in that sect of individuals that know what's going on, are more likely to vote for somebody because they're not bought off with 30-second ads and pieces of mail. But that's why the establishment, that's why the Democrats, that's why they want more people voting, because for lack of a better term, they don't want you or I voting. They want idiots voting. And I know you're not an idiot because you're listening to this show. That's how I know you pay somewhat attention to politics. If you care enough to listen to the Andrew Cooperrider show, then you're not a political idiot. If you care enough to know who your current state senator and state house rep is, your magistrate is, your judge executive is, you know more than 99.9% of people on the street. I'm telling you right now. I'm telling you right now. You do. You know more. And so Michael Adams takes a swipe at Senate Bill 334, tweeting out a video of Adrian Southworth with this caption saying, "It's no surprise the legislator who tried to keep us from requiring photo ID to vote is now trying to get our photo ID to vote law struck down," which is a gross misrepresentation of what's going on. I mean, she's restricting this bill, Senate Bill 334, restricts the voter ID law to requiring only allowing government-issued IDs to be used to vote. This isn't striking down a voter ID law. It's enhancing the purpose behind a voter ID law, but Michael Adams can't have that. He can't have that. He doesn't want the crazies passing any laws to deal with Kentucky. Even if objectively speaking, I would hope a Secretary of State would say, look, we don't actually want people to go ahead and be voting using a college issued ID or an employer issued ID to verify their identification. We don't want them using a credit or a debit card to establish their identification. We want it to be something where we've had to check their birth certificate or citizenship status, because that is what's really key here, is making sure that we are checking a person's citizenship status. See, when you allow employer identification or college identification, debit credit card identification, I'm telling you right now, the way that these people who are in our country right now that are illegally here, how they work is a lot of times they will use the social and name of somebody they know, or the social of somebody they know, but use their name or vice versa or what have you, in order to get paychecks issued to them so they can cash them and for tax documents. And then all those tax incomes go to one person's name, and maybe that person just doesn't pay taxes, or, they give them a cut of their pay so they can pay the taxes for them, so on and so forth. But there could be 10 people using one person's ID. And they can go down and they can go ahead and get employer identification, a university identification that is verified through a W-9, which just requires you to provide some sort of identifications that are verified by a non-government employee to then issue you a photo ID with a name on it that you can now use to vote. That is a great way to ensure and to allow non-U.S. citizens to be able to vote in our elections, and something we should be standing against, something you'd like to see your Secretary of State standing against. But to him, well, that's a crazy proposition, and he'd rather lie about what the bill does than to actually take this common sense stance about securing elections here in Kentucky. Well, coming up after this, Austin Horn, reporter for the Herald Leader, recently tweeted out a survey, an article where they surveyed teachers in districts in Kentucky on whether or not they wanted more money. No, I'm not kidding. We'll have more after this short break. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. Want to reach out to the show? Feel free to email info@theandrewshow.com. Once again, that's info@theandrewshow.com. Did you know that if you ask a school district, do you want more money, they would respond yes? Did you know that? Now, I had some inclination that was true, but apparently over at the Herald Leader, not only did they need to write an article about that, but a survey was actually done that asked 93 Kentucky public school superintendents whether or not they wanted more money. And shock of all shocks, 96% said they did. I want to know what happened to the other 4%. Did they not understand the question? Because clearly, if you ask any school district, do you want more money? Guess what they're going to say? Yeah, I would like more money. I would like more money. But the bottom line, this survey and article is all built upon this idea that our education system, our teachers, our districts, they're not being paid enough money. They're not being paid enough. According to, this is from the article, a representative of CASA said, "We are compelled to emphasize the proposed state budget, while commendable in many aspects, falls short in one critical area, enabling school districts to offer competitive teacher salaries to address the dire and growing teacher shortage." Now, this is all based upon an idea that teachers in Kentucky are not paid enough. We hear it so often. We hear Beshear talking about it all the time. We hear many members of our so-called political class constantly talking about how teachers are not paid enough. And really, I think this deals with this notion that has never been challenged. But here, I'm going to challenge it. I challenge the notion on whether or not we really want everybody voting. Now we're going to challenge this notion that teachers in Kentucky are not paid well. So let's dig into it. So according to the NEA, the same place that Beshear quotes from in order to get his average teacher pay, to say that Kentucky is ranked 44th in the nation, that's this NEA group. According to them, they say the average teacher pay in Kentucky is $54,139. Now, according to a few different sources, the average teacher is working 180 days a year. Kids are in school 170 days, and then they get another 10 days for planning and professional development. So on a 180-day year, kids are in school 7 hours a day. So let's add another 2 hours a day every day for outside of regular school hours of teacher work, because, you know, they got to grade papers and prepare and everything else. Now, teachers, of course, will say, I've got to bring papers home and work and blah, 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 but they kind of leave out that they leave work at 3 o'clock. But anyways, but let's give them 2 hours a day to do their other work, because keep in mind, they still get a lunch and they still get about an hour a day of planning period to go ahead and do that work as well. So they're getting about 3 hours a day under what I'm saying in order to prepare for 6 hours of classroom time. Now, I understand that teachers have different arguments on this. We'll talk about those here in a second, but let's just move forward with this. So you got your 10 days a year. I'm giving you 2 hours a day plus your other planning hours. So you get 3 hours a day of planning plus 10 days a year of planning. So that works out to 9 hours a day 180 days a year. So that's 1,620 days. So if we take 54,139, their average pay, according to NEA, and divide it by 1,620, we get $33.41 an hour plus benefits. Now, y'all, the average bachelor pay in Kentucky is only $21.12 an hour. $21.12 an hour. Now, you could say, well, Andrew, that needs to be higher too. Just because average bachelor pay is low in Kentucky doesn't mean we should have low teacher pay, but I challenge you that part of the reason why pay is so low is because Kentucky's cost of living is also so low. Kentucky is ranked 47th in cost of living. It makes sense that some of our salaries would be lower than the national average. If they were higher, then, well, our cost of living would be higher, wouldn't it be? So teachers say, yeah, well, we got to work 180 days, but we work more than just those hours. So it's not really comparing apples to apples. $33.41 an hour. I'm working way more than that, let me tell you. So let's get away from hourly pay then. All right. Let's deal with all your issues about working outside of normal work hours. Guess who else does? Every other single salaried employee. I mean, I understand teachers have generally never worked another salaried employee job outside of the government. But if you bother to go out into the real world of work, and I'm not trying to play down teachers here, and there's a lot of great teachers out there, and there's a lot of teachers that recognize this, but I'm sick and tired of hearing this lie that they're underpaid, because it is a lie. It is a lie. And some of you that are teachers listening to this may be greatly offended. And you're free to email me, info@theandrewshow.com, with your opinions, but just listen first, okay? Because let's compare apples to apples. If you've ever worked out in a job in private sector and you're paid a salary, you know you're working often. You're working far more than 8 hours a day. You work outside of work hours. You're at night working on projects. You're doing things outside of that time, just like everybody else. So let's compare a salaried employee to a salaried employee. So teachers, they work 180 days. Okay. Now, a normal salaried employee, there's 52 weeks in a year. So let's say a normal salaried employee gets 20 days off a year, or about a month, 4 weeks off a year. Well, that means that taking out weekends, which they work on their weekends too. I don't often hear teachers talking about working on their weekends a whole lot, but trust me, salaried employees will find themselves working on their weekends as well. So if we take a look at that, comparing apples to apples here, teachers work 180 days. A normal salaried employee will work 240 days a year if they take 20 Monday through Friday days off a year. So 240 days a year. So the days works because they're not getting summers and spring breaks and fall breaks, right? So what's just accounting for all that? If a teacher was a normal salaried employee at their normal rate of pay, it is the equivalent of a normal salaried employee making $72,185 a year. That's an average. Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that's doctor lawyer money, but that's not bad money. It's 34% higher, apples to apples comparison, for the same education level as if you went out there and got a business degree. So you go out and you get a business degree. On average, you're going to make 34% less than your average teacher does that gets a bachelor's. 34% higher. They want to tell us, hey, we're not paid enough. I don't believe you. How much more do you need to get paid? How much more do you need for it to, quote unquote, be a fair amount of pay for you? How much more do we need to pay in order to attract in teachers? Because I'll give you a hint. It's not a small amount of money according to these schools. You know, all these schools surveyed, is it enough money? They all answered no. But guess what? If you ask them how much more do you need, what do you think their answer is? Because one of the things that they stand behind, you'll hear Beshear do this too. He calls for 11% raise for all school employees, not just teachers. One thing they leave out, one thing people don't often want to talk about, is the fact that the average administrator in Kentucky, school administrator, according to salary.com, is getting paid $80,599 a year. $81,000 a year. That is mid-level manager pay, executive level pay at a traditional company. It is very competitive on our job market. That is my point. what a teacher gets paid is very competitive for similar education. And I know people say, look, that's not the same work environment. I hear you. But you're getting paid so much more than others, though. You are. And you get a lot of benefits and time off. And you'll hear your teacher say, well, I've got to work a second job. Well, that makes sense because you're only working 180 days a year while everybody else is working 240 days a year. Yeah, it makes sense you got to work another 60 days a year to make the same high level of income as everybody else does, making the same amount you do, because you're working 60 days less a year. And I know they'll claim all these things, but come on, let's be honest here. They get the days off. They do. But that's not all this article says to betray the point that it will never be enough. There's so much more in here. We'll be digging into that after this short break. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. Upset because I've broken down this belief that teachers are underpaid. Well, feel free to email me, info@theandrewshow.com. Once again, that's info@theandrewshow.com. We'll be back here in just a few short minutes. And you are back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source of Kentucky politics. If you didn't listen to the last section, well, you're probably not mad at me yet, but I'll inform you to know where we're at, so that way you can be mad at me. We're talking about teachers' salaries, and we're talking about Beshear's call and district's call, claiming that they need to be paid more. Herald Leader recently published an article talking about a survey they did of districts, and surprise, 96% of them said that they're not being given enough money, period. Now, they didn't tell us how much more they needed. They just said they're not being given enough. And what would upset some less discerning people is that I've been challenging the idea that teachers are even underpaid to begin with. We took a look at comparing apples to apples, a traditional salaried job, and looking at average pays, and we came out that teachers are making about $72,185 a year if you were to compare what they're getting paid to a job that actually worked year-round. Because that's something so many people forget, but that's a major part of the job. That's a trackman of the job. You get 60 days off, you work 60 days less a year than your average salaried employee. And if you're just now tuning in and trying to claim, no, I work the same as an average salaried employee, you're just lying to yourself. I mean, I have yet to run into a teacher that when you sit and talk to them one-on-one about how often they're working, they'll sit there and be like, I get time off over the summer. Yeah, they'll admit it, but they can't say that. I mean, it's this victim mentality, this victim idea that we push in our culture. You have to be a victim. And obviously, if you're trying in the court of public opinion to get paid more and more, and who doesn't want to get paid more? I want to get paid more. You want to get paid more. So if you're trying in the court of public opinion to get paid more, of course, you're going to say, I'm not paid enough. That's what you're going to claim. And look, I'm not faulting you for doing that, but let's be real honest here about what you're currently getting paid, because it ain't that bad. It's not bad at all. It's actually greatly above average compared to other salaried positions in Kentucky and the benefits and so on and so forth. But as to betray the point that there's never enough money, the Kentucky budget does raise the SEEK formula up to, $4,455. Well, currently that's at $4,200. So it increases per pupil spending, per pupil budget to the district's $255 a student, but it also greatly increases school funding transportation. So right now in current fiscal year, it's $274 million for funding for transportation for K through 12 education here in Kentucky. And they're raising that to $319 million in the first upcoming year. And then it would increase again to $359 million in the following school year. So it would go ahead and go up about $80 million. About $80 million or so would be the difference between where we're at now and where we'll be in 2 years. $80 million more in spending. Now, what's funny is in this survey they asked, they said, well, the SEEK formula improvements, that's not enough to provide a substantive raise. According to them, the fact that another $200 more per student, which keep in mind, they're being paid, right? Right now, it's $4,200, and that'd go up $255, okay? So $4,000 so $255 is 6% increase in pupil funding. So you see a 6% increase in pupil funding. But what do you think they say this increase in SEEK formula? They say, look, we can only 6%, 54% of respondents to this survey said that under current budget proposal, they can only offer a salary increase of 0 to 2%. 34% estimate they'll be able to provide a 2 to 3% increase, and only 6% estimate they'll be able to provide a 3 to 4% teacher salary. 5.5% indicated they could give raises over 2 years of no more than 5%. Which, think about that for a second. Your funding from the state is going up 6%. But teachers' salaries can't increase by 6%? It just tells you where their priorities are. 54%, over half that are surveyed, said we can only give a raise of 2% under a budget that is increasing per pupil funding by 6%. The money is not going to the teacher. If they wanted to give a pay raise, if they really wanted to give a pay raise to the teachers, they're being provided with enough funding. They could give a 6% raise to the teachers, but they give a 6% raise to the teachers. Guess what? They can't use their salaries and use the talking point. Teachers aren't paid enough to continue to rob more money from the taxpayer. This is the same reason why our government doesn't prioritize infrastructure spending, because spending money on the roads is one thing we can all agree on. But if you mess up and actually do it for them, if you actually fund and handle all the infrastructure issues, well, now you don't have this frontline issue to demagogue in order to go ahead and get in more funding. So they say, we need more pay for the teachers. They're provided a 6% increase in SEEK formula, but they say, over half say, we can't even give over a 2% raise under this plan. In addition to the SEEK formula, they also are getting $80 million more in funding to transportation. And 60% of those respondents asked said the additional transportation funding included in the budget proposal would not make higher staff salaries more likely. So they get $80 million more plus a 6% increase in funding from the state. And over half of them are saying we can't give a raise more than 2%. And the increased funding won't make a difference to our ability to give salaries. How much more do you need? What is the dollar amount? I can tell you their priorities are messed up. Because if a budget proposal is giving a 6% increase in funding to schools, but you can only give teachers a less than 2% funding, well, the problem doesn't seem to be the money. It seems to be your priorities. Remember, the average administrator is making over $80K a year, over $80,000 a year. Where's the money going? If another $80 million in funding into transportation to allow you to spend that on transportation, freeing up $80 million more dollars for education. So on top of the 6%, you're freeing up $80 more million for everyone. That's not enough. How much more do you need? Because I know it's going to be hundreds of millions. And guess what? Here in 2 years, next time they're making a budget, who's going to have their hat out begging for more dollars? It's going to be our K through 12 education saying it's not enough. We need more money. I can't give you a figure, because if I give you a figure of how much I need in order to actually educate kids, and you give it to me, you'll expect me to educate kids. Because look, studies have been done. Increased funding doesn't equal better output from the educational system. They don't have more kids learning because you spend more. They're lying to you. They're lying about teachers' pay being bad in the first place, because it's not. Then they literally are showing exactly what their priorities are. I'm going to say this again. Over half say, I can't do a raise more than 2%. despite getting a 6% increase in funding. 6% increase. They should be able to increase their funding on everything by 6% if they're getting a 6% increase. Fascinating, isn't it? It's just fascinating to see how their priorities land. Now they'll say, well, we can't get, that's a 6% increase from one location, but we're pulling in money from the federal government. We're pulling in money locally. We're pulling in money from these other places. That's exactly right. You are. Why does it fall to the state government to be the one making sure you can get your teachers' raises done? Why does it fall to the state government to pay for your salary choices? I mean, think about this, okay? The fact that you've decided as a district to pay your administrators more and you pay your teachers less, it gives you an issue to go to the state on. Gives you an issue to hold your hat out, because they can't hold their hat out and say, we need more for the administrators. That's why Beshear will talk about teachers needing to be paid more and then turn around and say it's 11% raise that he wants for all public school employees, because he can't tell you that it's for the admins. He can't tell you that. He can't say it's for all those people in our school system that don't actually teach kids, that are the ones delivering failure after failure. Because you know what? Our educational system, it isn't even producing results in the first place. Well, y'all, that's what we got time for today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Thank you all so much for joining me. Back here tomorrow. Have a great rest of your day.